being wealthy is not about having tons of money, ridiculous as that sounds. It's about knowledge, and actually, so 70% of lottery winners who win millions and millions of pounds are bankrupt within 5 years because they never acquired that knowledge. Learning about finance such that you can actually do a really good job with your finances and hit this kind of seven-figure, sum that I'm talking about is genuinely, in terms of number of hours to acquire that knowledge and that skill, no harder than learning how to drive a car. And it's one of those weird sort of societal blind spots where we think, oh, no, learning about stock markets or finances, that's for rich people. Like that's not, I think it's perfectly normal to learn how to drive a car, but it's not, but it's, I shouldn't bother learning about finance because, that's just too complicated. It is no harder and it takes no longer to learn enough about finance to do a really good job with your finances.
Hello and welcome to the Who's Going to Stop Me podcast. Join us on an exciting journey to the depths of the human mind and soul of those who have been successful, of those who have been maybe where you want to go. I promise you one thing and one thing only by listening to this podcast, and that is a life that is more full, that is more exciting, and that will bring you more fulfillment. This episode features best-selling author of How to Own the World, Andrew Craig. His book has over 250 five-star reviews on Amazon. He's been featured in dozens of specialist financial publications. He's the founder of Plain English Finance and has met with over 1,000 CEOs. The conversation we had is a truly insightful conversation on everything to do with investment. You may be one of the people that think investment and finance isn't for you, and I'm here to tell you that it is. So no matter what stage you're at, whether you make $1 million a year or $20,000 a year, he's here to teach you to start where you are and invest piece by piece. So by the time you retire, you have a significant seven-figure sum. We also break down Andrew's phenomenal ideas on how to own the world's assets, the biggest mistakes you might be making in investing, and ultimately how to have the financial stability we all crave and aim for in life. The conversation is truly insight-filled, and I hope you enjoy. Don't forget, if you do take something from this conversation, please head over to iTunes and leave us a rating. Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew, for coming on. I'm so excited to have you on. I've been a big fan of yours, reading your books, reading your blogs, and kind of looking at your material. And personally, I've learned tons from it. And actually reading your book and maybe a couple of other people's books in unison gave me the confidence to first start making investments myself. So I'm really excited to have you on.
I'm honoured for you to say that. Thank you very much, Mikey.
Perfect. So let's dig in, like really at a grassroots level. You're the founder of Plain English Finance, best-selling author of How to Own the World, which we will get into later. Your companies essentially help people understand finance in a more kind of common sense way. Why should people care? Why is it important for people to understand these financial ideas and principles that your companies and books distill? Like, why should it matter to them?
So I think at the very basic level, it's very simple, really. It's because it just makes life much easier. I think it's one of the biggest educational failures in the sort of modern world is that people don't learn this stuff, and therefore, if you don't, it's a massive oversight that we don't teach this stuff in schools, right? Because if people understood these things, it's just far easier to just get your finances squared away, and far easier to sort of approach retirement, or even just if you start early enough into your 30s or 40s to find yourself in a much better place financially than you might otherwise be if you don't have this information.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we all get pensions, right? We all have a kind of a bank account. So why should someone really think more complex about investing or taking their money and doing something with it when, when they're 65, I'm not quite sure of the age, but they'll get like a state pension or some kind of handout in that way, or maybe from their job? Why should they really take an interest?
Well, because I think the key thing here is it's a question of how much. So the stats are quite frightening here. If you if you want to make the average, and I know your audience is very international, but let's just think in terms of, I'll use British examples. If you want to make the average British salary in retirement from the pot you've built up in your pension, you're going to need a pension pot of something like between five and £600,000 in order to generate about 30 grand a year. And the reality is that about the sort of rough numbers now for what the average person in Britain has saved by the time they hit retirement is more like £50,000. And sadly, there's still a sort of big sexual or sex gap here in terms of sorry, not sex gap, gender gap. In terms of women have 10 or 15,000 on average, and men have sort of 50 or 60,000 on average when they hit retirement. So that's enough to buy you an income of peanuts. And if you add that onto a state pension, the other thing here is that the state pension was created in 1909, when basically and it was for anybody who got to the age of 70 and beyond. Average life expectancy in 1909 was in the late 40s. So the average person lived to 47. Now that number is skewed by infant mortality statistically. But most people didn't. Very few people actually lived to 70. So you had an awful lot of workers paying into the pension system to support not very many people taking out of the pension system. The situation today is completely night and day different. So today, a child born today, scientists are telling us, is likely to live to 100. And that means, if you want to retire, let's just say for the sake of the moment, 60, you're going to need to fund 40 years. Now, given where government finances are on both sides of the Atlantic, frankly, all over the world, there's hardly a government in the world within the next kind of couple of decades that is going to be able to afford to pay people a livable pension that they can actually use, to lead a good life on. In future, I mean, and that's not a grey area for us to debate. That is just a statement of cold, hard sort of fact based on the way the maths are trending and the way the demographics are trending. So that's the bad news, and it is pretty bad news. But what I've tried to do with the book is set out the fact that there's some sort of countervailing good news, if you like, which is that it's getting a big investment pot by the time you're kind of 60-ish, and hopefully earlier, if people do start earlier, is a lot easier than people realize. And that's really the sort of that's the sort of whole basis of my book, is like, how do you get to, I mean, £1 million is a pretty arbitrary number, but it's at least enough to pay you a pretty decent annual income in retirement for the whole of your life if you get there. So how can somebody on an average salary realistically aspire to get to £1 million? And I don't know if I can elaborate, or if you rather than wanting to go on at great length, but if you want me to, I can give you some examples straight away of why that's why you can realistically get to 1 million, because a lot of people find that quite hard to believe.
Yeah, no, that would be brilliant. And just to echo your point, I think like the idea of starting young is not something, we're not taught. This is stuff that we're not taught in schools. It's
Yeah.
very fundamental advice and things that we need to know in schools. It's kind of like relationship advice. We're not really taught how to date or how to have great relationships, which is super important in life, but we're
Yeah.
not taught it. We're not taught how to manage our money, which every single person in a Western country is going to have to do at some point. So yeah, no, I'd love to know.
Well, and that's and I suppose whenever I do speaking events, the example I quite often start with, having done all this bad news about if you want 30 grand a year or thereabouts when you retire, you're going to need 600, 700 or 600,000 pounds in your pension pot. And a lot of people are quite shocked, and they're reiterating that point about the average person has 30 or 40 or 50 grand or whatever it is. But the first sort of good news point is, I talk about, imagine that you had somebody who was able to afford to put £5,000 in an investment account for your child the day your child is born. And I'm going to keep the maths really here, just to illustrate, really easy here, just to illustrate the point. Imagine then that £5,000 can grow at high single digits, and as I say, let's use 10% actually, just to keep the maths easy. 55 years later, the first day your child can legally retire, that £5,000, have a guess as to what that £5,000 will have turned into.
I have an idea because I've heard this example before.
Well, yeah, okay,
uh,
yeah. So people listening, it's the number for £10, 10% per annum on a £5,000 one-off investment with no further investment at all is £945,000. And that's just Einstein described compound interest as the eighth wonder of the world, and that is an example of just how incredibly powerful compound interest is. So I suppose the next question is, well, that's just nonsense. You've just used 10%. Interest rates are basically zero. Stock market investment's risky. And so on and so forth. But a stat I use to sort of, if you like, counter that argument is, so the world economy in 2000 was about $32 trillion. If you use as near as we can reckon it and governments can calculate it, obviously it's a pretty inaccurate number, but broadly it was $32 trillion. Using the same methodology of calculating world global output, global GDP, by 2015 it was $85 trillion. So that's basically a 163.5% growth in the size of the world economy in 15 years. So the maths are a bit more complicated than this, but if you divide 160-ish% by 15 years, you're talking about more than 10% per annum, right? That's what the global economy is growing at. And if you're able to gain exposure to that as an investor, which is the whole thrust of why my book's called How to Own the World. You have a serious chance. And I don't say, I don't talk about 11, 12, 13%, although that is possible. But through the economic cycle, pretty much regardless of what financial markets or stock markets in inverted commas are doing, you have scope to return certainly high single digits and to protect yourself in those down years that everyone else is scared of.
Brilliant, brilliant. So yeah, obviously it's in. I mean, that's huge, right? When I first learnt about if someone took £5,000 on the day I was born and they put it into an investment. Or some sort of investment account, or they managed it, or compounded interest 10% over time, it would turn into the best part, or basically nearly £1 million. I mean, that's crazy to think about. That's shocking.
It is. And then there's the other sort of thing people say, well, the stock market investment is inherently risky. Look what happened in 07, 08, 09. Basically stock markets all over the world more than halved. But I think this is the other point. Just to sort of step back a bit. What do I mean by how to own the world? What I mean is that this is a way of investing where you own essentially all types of asset class. So not just shares, but bonds, commodities, gold, property, basically all the major financial asset classes exist. And you do that, so that's called diversification by asset, and you do it, and you also diversify by geography. So you don't just have, if you're based in England or Britain, you don't have just British shares or the FTSE. You have investments from America, from Asia, and from the whole of Europe, including the UK. And if you do that, it's quite easy to sort of articulate why that makes sense and why that works. And you think about it like this: between '07 and '09, stock market's halved, as I said earlier. But in '08, oil hit an all-time high of $147 a barrel. And in '09, gold was up 19.5%. Sometimes Japan is on fire, or China is on fire, and the US struggles, or Britain struggles, or Europe struggles. But the lesson of about 200 years of sort of financial history is that if you own all asset classes in all geographies, you will be able to guard against that. You're not going to suffer that 50% fall because you own a stock market investment. It basically smooths your returns and makes the whole ride a lot less volatile, but still achieves significantly above the sort of interest rates you're going to get in a cash ISA or in a current account. And that's the whole crux of the book. And I think the other point to make here is that this isn't my idea. The richest and smartest people in the world have invested like this for the best part of 2 centuries. So, I always use the example of the Rothschild family. In 18 whatever, the Rothschilds were able to invest in Amsterdam, Frankfurt, London, and in bonds and shares and gold and all the asset classes as they existed then. You then look at Oxford and Cambridge universities. Both of those institutions have really, really significant endowment funds, like investment funds that are used to fund the colleges and fund science. We're talking about many billions of pounds of investment fund there, and Oxford and Cambridge invest exactly like this and have invested like this, ever since financial markets were created, basically, which is part of why those colleges are so wealthy, and they own so much land and wine and everything else, and can afford to have great science programs and research and development and everything else. And just to carry on the same theme, Harvard and Yale in the States and most of the other Ivy League colleges are exactly the same. And what this brings me on to, so the richest and smartest people have been doing this. People and institutions have been doing this for 2 centuries. My whole point, and if you like, the new news, is that it's now possible for, in inverted commas, a normal person, the man in the street, somebody on an average income, to do this. And that has actually only been the case for probably not even the last decade, because of inexpensive online trading accounts, because of new financial innovations and new types of funds that mean you, as a sort of somebody who can say even 50 quid a month or 100 quid a month, can end up owning all asset classes in all geographies. And that's kind of the whole basis of our business.
Yeah, and it's an amazing thing as well. Like with the internet and the way technology's progressed, that we have access to that. Because it is crazy to think, that I can own some property in some remote third world part of Asia, for example, and that me sitting in London or me sitting wherever I am, I can do that and have access to that at a few clicks of a button. So it's brilliant. And yeah, your whole philosophy, when I read your book, really opened my eyes to this principle of diversification and owning the world.
Yeah.
So it's brilliant.
Well, but the tragedy is, if I was to walk out on the street I'm in southwest London as we speak, in Wimbledon, if I was to walk out on the high street here and interview 100 people walking by, I reckon we'd be lucky if 3 or 4 of them are taking advantage of that reality, right? And the problem is that this is really simple fundamental information that hasn't changed for very long, which people find incredibly boring. And what then happens is you get something like Bitcoin and crypto, and you suddenly you get this social media explosion of interest in something that people believe can make them rich quick. And the lion's share of people who get swept into the dot-com boom of 99 2000, or the Bitcoin and crypto boom of the last 3 years, all of these people get swept into that, and then very often lose a lot of money as a result, but and never learn about the much simpler, you know, much more conservative investments that you can put in an ISA or a pension that have been around for 200 years. And that is part of my mission, if you like, my crusade, is trying to get people to just look at the stuff that's been, the financial asset classes and products that have served us well for certainly many decades, and in some cases a couple of centuries, rather than just get swept up into wherever the latest fad is, when you then get bruised and battered and give up on investment, which is a tragedy. I mean, you started this interview by saying, why should people care about this? And as I said, because it makes life easier. And the tragedy is, so many people think that investment, in inverted commas, is risky, or forgive my language, but a pension is, in inverted commas, shit. um, when a pension is, that's like saying cars are shit. A pension is just a type of tax sheltered account within which you can do any number of things. And the same is true of an ISA. And we can perhaps come onto that as a theme. But these days, if you're British and you're under about the age of 50, I would say that the ISA account, stocks and shares ISA, is the number one thing that people should be looking at to be building wealth in a very conservative, sensible, and safe way.
Mm-hmm. I think you really made a fantastic point there, in that conservative and safe investments and ideas just don't sell as well. They don't get as many clicks online as, say, like, oh, okay, invest in this new hot thing, this fad that's taking the world by storm. And Joe Blogs, he made a 10,000% return on his investment in 3 months, and you can do the same. I find that people's psychology, and I know this because I do a lot of marketing, that if you show them that option, they're less likely to want to be involved than some instant gratification, quick fix, magic pill. People are always looking for this magic pill versus the very steady, slow growth. I don't know. It blows my mind, but that's why Bitcoin, and I'm a big fan of Bitcoin and blockchain, and how it's going to revolutionize kind of payments and stuff like this. I'm a really big supporter of it. But on the flip side of it, it's not just about how much money you can make. It's not this, like, there's much more to it than, okay, put your money into Bitcoin and then you're going to be rich and wealthy
in 10 minutes. I mean, I saw people in groups on Facebook, in sort of late 2017, talking about how they were so excited because they were going to turn £500 into being a multi-millionaire. And that was rife all over the internet at the time. And I wrote about this in the new edition of my book at some length. How I can't remember. Is it 2 billion people are on Facebook? Anyway, it's something like that, and how many hundreds of millions who have an iPhone or an Android phone. And so what's so crazy to me about this is that I was a stockbroker in London in 99 2000 when the dot-com boom happened. I was at Swiss Bank when we floated lastminute.com, and I remember just the madness, the insanity of everyone was getting rich and everyone was making thousands of pounds a week punting this, that, and whatever else. And then, of course, the tide went out, and most people lost a lot of money. People lost their life savings, people committed suicide. It was a very depressing time, and I suppose the point that the crypto boom of 2017 was that cubed, and the reason for that is because in 99, when the dot-com boom, you basically, actually, I can't remember the stats, but not a huge percentage of the world even had an email address in 99. The internet was new and email was quite new, and I mean, most people in the developed world had an email address, but people in China or India or most of the developing world hadn't even got email addresses yet. And even though most people weren't sort of part of that global network of new technology, you saw this huge dot-com boom, and you saw massive price rises and all this sort of frenzy, this crazy frenzy of dot-com boom, and then this massive crash. And here we are, how many years later, and the same thing happens in crypto, except that it was much, much worse and much, much stronger, because this time around, everyone in the world's got an email address. Everyone in the world, or a huge number of people in the world, have got a smartphone, and a huge number of people are sitting on Facebook groups seeing their mates just bought himself a new, whatever, or gone on, or moved to, well, without wanting to impugn, you moved to Thailand or whatever, because they've made so much money in the last 3 months in Bitcoin. And not only did we not learn the lessons of 99 2000, which is a tragedy, because Mark Twain said history rhymes, right? One of the easiest ways of kind of thinking about the present is to look at the past, obviously with a few additional, more sophisticated thoughts, because things are always a bit different. But there are lessons that can be learned, and not only have we not learned that lesson, but this time it was 10 times worse, because there were so many more people being swept in because of social media. And which is why Bitcoin, was it a Finnish student who sold 2 pizzas in, I don't know, 2013, or maybe a bit earlier than that, for X number of Bitcoins. Or no, sorry, he bought 2 pizzas off somebody for however many Bitcoins, and those pizzas at the peak in December 2017 would have been worth $200 million US. It's just like, never in the whole history of humanity have you seen that sort of price appreciation. Not even the tulip bubble in Holland in, like, whenever that was, the 1690s or whatever. I mean, I've probably got that wrong, but thereabouts. It's just madness. But and you're right. People do. People will listen to that siren song and then get really badly punished. But the real tragedy of that is life is a marathon, not a sprint. And I think it was Bill Gates said something like, "You'll be amazed. It's amazing how most people overestimate what they can achieve in a year and massively underestimate what they can achieve in 10 years or a lifetime." And in investment, that is such an important thing to think about, because ultimately, what do you want to do? You want it to be easy. You want it to be set and forget. You want to be able to sleep at night, but you want to wake up when you're 55 or 58 or 60 with £1 million in the bank, and the ability to ease off a bit and live a good life. And the tragedy is that that's actually quite easy to do if you don't get swept up in these periodic, crazy sort of get rich quick events.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with you. And the Bitcoin Pizza Day, they call it, is actually a big celebration in the Bitcoin community, because it's the first time people consider like an actual transaction happen, like someone paid some Bitcoin for something in the real world. So
I didn't know that. So that pizza transaction, where was it? Helsinki or somewhere, wasn't it?
I think I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was, it was definitely, I think it was Scandinavia.
But I didn't realize that was the first time that somebody had actually bought something tangible with a Bitcoin.
Right.
madness to be. I wouldn't want to be that
Right,
person.
right. Every day, every year, rather, it's celebrated, and people make memes and go and have pizza. Like in Tokyo, it's a big thing where people will go to this part of Tokyo called Roppongi, and they'll go and spend their bitcoins on pizza on that day. So, but back to like more the investment side of things. Why should someone? Obviously, we know why someone should care now, but why should someone? People do view things as risky, right? And there is an element of
Yeah,
risk, but
yeah,
there's risk in crossing the road. But why shouldn't I put
yeah.
my money into my bank account? My bank account has a savings account, right? A quote unquote savings account. Why can't I just not leave it in there?
So there's a thing so when people talk about risk, one of the risks they forget is actually a really important risk that not many people have heard of or understand, and that's something called underperformance risk. And so what I mean by that is, if you put your money, particularly now with interest rates at the artificially low level they're at, and they've been at for years because of the policies of central banks all over the world, the simple fact of the matter is that real inflation, right? And this is one of the themes of my book. Real inflation, the devaluation of the pound or dollar or euro or yen or whatever, or baht in your pocket, is more than interest rates that you will get paid by putting your money in the bank right now. Okay, and we can come on in more detail to how I evidence that statement, because some people look at the headline CPI or RPI inflation numbers and tell me that's not true, but it is true. And perhaps we'll go into that in a bit more detail in a sec. But what that means is, if you just put your money in the bank in a current account, or even in the UK with a cash ISA, and I'm on record pretty regularly of telling people that should never have a cash ISA. But if you just put your money in the bank and don't invest your money, you are getting destroyed by inflation. And what that means is that you are actually losing real wealth every year. And it's kind of like filling a bath up with the plug open, and all the water draining out the bottom. That's not a very good analogy, but I think you get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Um, you know, putting money just in the bank because you're worried about that financial market investment is, in inverted commas, risky, is for your long-term ability to be wealthy and comfortable, is actually riskier than not putting money into financial investments. And as and again, this is the whole point of why my book's called How to Own the World. As I said a minute ago, financial investing in financial markets, is actually not that risky if you know what you're doing, and if you are diversified by asset and by geography. Because when one lot goes up, another lot, when something goes down a lot, something else goes up a lot. There are financial markets that are negatively correlated, and never before in history has it been easier, cheaper, or more tax efficient to do this. It's just that too few people are telling that story. So keeping your money on the mattress is not a strategy that's ever going to make you wealthy. And actually, people think that's safe. It's not safe, because inflation is, you are losing real money every year, and that means that you have a high probability of being, having a really impoverished retirement. Learning how to do global multi-asset investment is really quite easy. And one of the other, and I quite often use the car, like driving and cars, as a sort of analogy here. If most people, when they're 17 years old, are lucky enough in the developed world, or 15 if you're in one of the southern states of America, I think, or lucky them. But in sometime in your mid to late teens in the developed world, you can learn how to drive a car, right? And we all think that's really normal. And I don't know, how many hours did it take you to learn how to drive a car? Tens of hours, dozens of hours, I don't know, however many it was, right? And we all think that's completely normal. We all think that's for everyone. No matter what background you're from, what walk of life, you learn how to drive a car, and unless you're really, really unfortunate and underprivileged, but most people do, and we think that's normal. You wouldn't drive a car on a motorway until you've passed your test and learned how to drive a car, because if you did, you might crash. But learning about finance such that you can actually do a really good job with your finances, and hit this kind of seven-figure, sum that I'm talking about, is genuinely, in terms of number of hours to acquire that knowledge and that skill, no harder than learning how to drive a car. And it's one of those weird sort of societal blind spots where we think, oh, no, no, learning about stock markets or finances, that's for rich people. Like, that's not, I think it's perfectly normal to learn how to drive a car, but it's not, but it's, I shouldn't bother learning about finance, because, that's just too complicated. It is no harder, and it takes no longer to learn enough about finance to do a really good job with your finances. Um, and, that's something, again, that's a point that I labor quite a lot in the book. And I think when people take that on board, it does actually, it sort of, it's quite obvious with hindsight. And the other thing I'd say on that, by the way, is that this idea that financial markets or the stock market, whatever, is something for rich people gets correlation and causality the wrong way round. So, people who learn about the stock market tend to become wealthy. Genuinely, it's not about income; it's about financial literacy. And that whole idea that, only 3% of society or 5% of society should learn about financial market investment is really, really unhelpful for a lot of people. And there's a great book called The Millionaire Next Door, which is basically about, there's some statistical evidence that most millionaires in America aren't people who make $300,000 a year in some high power job. They're just kind of actually relatively normal people who've learned the basics of property and stock market investment, which is much more common in America than it is in a lot of the rest of the world. So that was a very rambling answer.
No, that was brilliant. I think that
Hopefully.
was brilliant, and I think you'll inspire a lot of people to go, actually, okay, this is something that I can do. Then this is accessible to me, because I think one of the biggest hurdles is that separation in your mind, thinking, you know what, that stock market stuff, that like investment stuff, that's not for me. I only earn £30,000 or dollars a year, or 40,000.
Yeah.
It's not for me. I don't have the money. I don't know where to start. So their mind wouldn't even be open. So I think that's half the battle, and that's something that I've seen you do brilliantly, is break things down and really make people go, actually, okay, this is something for me. So I don't think it was
Yeah, well,
rambling.
and it is exactly right. I mean, one of the big fallacies is, firstly, people are afraid of it and think it's too complicated. Oh, that stuff's all really complicated, and it doesn't have to be. Like, it's complicated to become incredibly knowledgeable and become a great trader, but to do basic investment over a lifetime into something like an ISA is not complicated. And I mean, I'll flatter myself to say my book's 300 pages long or whatever it is. By the end of that, that'll take you how many hours to read. I genuinely, and I know from experience, that that's kind of enough. That's all you need. No, there are obviously plenty of other books you can read. Um, it's all you need to do a sort of set and forget um, approach to regular monthly investment that you're comfortable with and you feel happy with. And then, so the first thing is not being afraid that it's too hard. But the second thing as well, which you mentioned just now, is not thinking I don't have enough money. Because if you start in your 20s, I mean, basically, the rule is, if you whatever you make, whatever income you generate from the minute you're generating income, if you can put 10% of it away into these sorts of investments without fail for the whole of your kind of adult working life, you will have a really, really decent amount of money by the time you retire. And obviously that means when you're in your, when you're in your 20s and you don't earn that much, and you're facing brutal rents in a city like London or Vancouver or New York or wherever your audience might be listening to this from, it's, you might only be able to save 25 quid a month or 50 quid a month or dollars or whatever currency we're talking about. But by the time you're like 45 and you've been promoted a bit and you're earning a bit more, if you're up, the average person on about £30,000 a year in the UK should be able to save anywhere between 50 and 100 quid, based on sort of 10% of their take home pay. Um, and that, people think that's too small to make a difference, but that is enough to mean that you have over £1 million when you hit sort of 60, as long as you start early enough. And I think that's the other thing that people are quite shocked by, is just how, to go back to that point about Einstein describing compound interest as the eighth wonder of the world, and it is that eighth wonder. It is compound interest that means that small numbers. I mean, I always say hundreds can turn into millions, and people kind of roll their eyes and think, well, that just sounds like nonsense. But it's actually, that is how the maths works. And I think it's quite an important message that we should be teaching 16-year-olds, or at least 21-year-olds. And sadly, a lot of people go through their life without ever being taught this stuff, which is a big failure of our education system.
Right, and then they go on and they suffer later in life because of it, and that's the real shame.
Well, and that's the other, that's the other slightly sort of cheesy line that I use. I mean, I describe financial literacy. We are, what's the thing? We are all about financial literacy, empowering people to understand the nuts and bolts of finance and stuff that hasn't changed for like 200 years. And I describe financial literacy as a silver bullet, like a sort of miracle panacea, miracle cure kind of thing. Because basically, any individual who is in possession of genuine financial literacy is going to find their life a lot easier. truly, because this stuff's not that complicated, but it makes a big difference over 20 or 30 years. Um, and of course so that's for the individual and for their for if you if you basically know about financial markets and can do a good job of your finances as a result, that means that you're not going to be on the welfare rolls. You're going to be able to support you and yours. There's a better chance that you're going to be able to get ahead and support your dependents and all that good stuff. But arguably even more important actually is that for society as a whole, I mean, we've already said it means that the welfare bill's much lower, right? Because everyone's managed to actually take ownership of themselves and sort themselves out. Um, but in aggregate, it also means that there's more capital available in the system if people are investing for, I don't know, a biotech company to find the money to cure cancer or dementia or Parkinson's or whatever else. This is how the more people care about finance and investment, the more capital there is available to sort of solve intractable human problems. And that's another angle, which means that overall, the impact, it's a silver bullet for the individual and it's a silver bullet for society. And, things like lots of people are concerned about climate change and global warming. Well, one of the key methods by which those problems are going to be solved is really smart companies with loads of money innovating and spending billions of dollars or pounds or whatever on R&D and figuring out how do we clean the oceans of plastic? How do we develop solar power? I mean, Germany, not many people know this, but Germany had nearly 80% of its energy in the first quarter of this year from renewable sources. 80%. That, the biggest economy in Europe. Yeah, and most people are, people are quite rightly worried about climate change and worried about these sorts of issues. But the way we solve these problems is actually weirdly enough, I mean, there's this whole argument that money and investing, there's a sort of moral angle. A lot of people say, oh, money's the root of all evil. I think the absolute reverse is true. Actually, the way that humans over history have solved problems like climate change is by pooling capital and pooling resources. And so, I'm probably going slightly off track there, but you can hopefully tell I'm quite passionate about this, and I really believe this that for the individual it's a silver bullet, and for society and for, if you like, the world, it's a silver bullet as well.
I can definitely feel you're passionate about it, and all that additional information that you're giving is not rambly at all. I think it's really, really good to know for someone who's maybe like confused about this, or who isn't even aware that this is a possibility. So, and it's definitely inspiring to hear your passion, and that you want to spread the message. So it's really inspiring. But okay, let's say someone is, now that their interest is peaked, they're like, you know what, like I'm ready to go. Like let's get started. Maybe you could overview your owning the world idea, and kind of, I don't know if you call it a strategy or a mindset, but and break down maybe some of the main asset classes and kind of how it works.
Sure. Necessarily, I think I obviously know the most about how to do this if you're British and based in the UK. And just to digress slightly quickly, the reason for that is, so owning the world, as I said earlier, just means all major financial asset classes, and those are basically shares, bonds, cash, commodities, and within commodities, precious metals, so gold and silver. And then you've got agricultural commodities, so wheat, cotton, coffee, etc., etc. And then you've also got energy commodities, so oil, uranium, gas, etc. All that stuff. So basically everything, right? It's owning everything now, and owning everything to the extent that you can in the three major geographic blocks of the world, which are the States, Europe, and I include Britain in Europe. Whatever your stance on Brexit, and we won't come on to that, but just in terms of time zone, that bit of the world, and then Asia. So the three main sort of geographical blocks of the world. Now, in order to own sort of, if you like, all assets in all geographies, you need quite sophisticated financial services. If you're sitting in London, it's quite easy to do. If you're sitting in New York or San Francisco, it's quite easy to do. It's obviously not very easy to do if you're sitting in Damascus or Mogadishu, right? And actually, weirdly enough, it's not that easy to do if you're in if you're in Paris or Berlin, because the financial services on the continent aren't as innovative and sophisticated as they are in my experience and in the main. And these things move quickly, so maybe I'm a little bit out of date, but you know we are you're very lucky if you're basically Anglo and based in Britain or America, and you want to do this. So on the with apologies to anyone who's sitting here listening to this in a developing country which doesn't have the sort of financial services or government tax sheltered accounts like ISAs, I am going to, my answer will be based on the assumption, because much as I'd love to be an expert on every single financial market, retail financial market in the world, sadly I'm not quite there yet. But in the UK, I don't know, let's say you're in your early 30s or your mid 30s, and you've got to a point and you've calibrated your life in terms of expenditure, so you can save 10% of your income. And by the way, just a quick aside on that, a lot of people say, "Oh, how can I can't save 10% of my income?" Well, this is a really weird sort of neuro-linguistic programming psychological trick. Um, you've probably heard of the expression reframing, which psychologists use to describe. Reframing is something you can use in any area of your life. It's a clever psychological trick, so you can actually get the result you're looking for. And so I'm rambling a bit, but what I specifically mean here is, rather than thinking about 10%, how do I save 10% of my income? You can actually turn it on its head and say, how do I spend 90% of what I earn every month? And weirdly enough, that actually works to mean that you end up with 10% to put into investments. Um, and I'm trying to think of another example, which is a better one of why reframing works. But it's just a way of thinking about, can I live on 90% of my, or if I can I live by spending 90% of my income every month? Actually, you reasonably quickly find that is a mindset that means you will end up saving 10%. So to assume you've got to the point where you can save 10% of your income every month, you need to just pay it. You need to find a stockbroking firm, and I personally use one called Hargreaves Lansdown. But there's another one called AJ Bell You Invest. There's another one called Interactive Investor. You can find this stuff online quite easily. But all you need to make sure is that you use a firm that provides you with an ISA account, which gives you access to loads of funds and shares, and will invest your money monthly by direct debit. And generally, those sorts of firms in the UK market are better than the high street banks. I have to be a bit careful about saying that, but in my experience, getting an ISA with a high street bank tends to mean they have a very limited range of products, and they can also be quite expensive and not very good. So basically, all you need to do is set up an ISA account and have a direct debit of whatever you can afford to pay each month going into that account, and then into a fund or funds that give you exposure to as wide a diversity of investments as possible. Um, I mean, I can come on in more detail to specifically what those might look like, but I'll just stop there, given I've been rambling for however many minutes.
No, that's great. That's fantastic. So just essentially, that's a really good reframing point, by the way, that I really like that idea. Thinking about, I think if you ask someone, can you spend 90% of what you earn? They'd go, yeah, sure I can. But that actually means you're saving 10%. That's a neat little idea.
Yeah, and it sounds it's funny. I'm very glad you said that, because I felt like I didn't explain the point very well at all. And in my book, that's the sort of reasonably complicated thought process that looks, it's better in black and white and set down on paper over a few pages of a book, rather than trying to explain it verbally. Um, the other thing, by the way, in this era of extremely expensive house prices and rents, that a lot of people sort of, that it's a very obvious way of how you find 10% of your income is if you are, um, if you're living somewhere where your rent or your mortgage payments are really, really high, take it on the chin and move. Because that is rather than trying to save money by spending less in the pub every weekend, or not spending £3 a day in Starbucks or whatever on overpriced coffee every morning, which is basically tinkering around the edges and has a low probability of success. The most fundamental way that the average person can free up money to invest, to make sure they do invest 10% a month, is by making sure that whatever they're paying in mortgage or rent payments isn't more than it should be. And without wanting to digress too much, I make the point in the book that in France, it used to be, I think it might still be the law, that you can't have mortgage payments that are more than a third of your salary. So, in the UK, because we've all been so obsessed with property, a lot of people spend a lot more than that. A lot of people spend a lot more than a third of their salary on putting a roof over their head. And, I started in the city in the late 90s, and I had a pretty decent, well-paid job for a sort of 23-year-old or whatever. But I still lived in what a lot of my friends thought was a pretty dodgy part of town. Because it just meant that I had more disposable income. I couldn't afford to live in Notting Hill or Chelsea or somewhere very, in inverted commas, posh in central London. I lived somewhere that wasn't, and that had significant benefits in terms of what I was able to save. So now I think I've slightly lost the thread again,
No, no, no.
Mikey.
It's perfect. That's perfect because we're digging into the kind of asset classes a little bit. So you spoke about
Well,
property there. So
the nuts and bolts of how, the nuts and bolts of how, brass tacks, what do you actually do? So calibrate your life so you can save 10% a month, and as you kindly repeated, so think of it in terms of how do I will allow myself to spend. I will allow myself, pardon my bad language, I'll allow myself to piss away 90% of my income every month, right, on fun and holidays and whatever. Or if you're a bit older, nappies and whatever, all the other expenses that come with having a kid, or kids. But where there's a will, there's a way, and there is a way. If genuinely, if you really look yourself in the eye, in the mirror, and are honest with yourself, there's for most people there's a way of saving 10% of your income, even from not from kind of the first, from your first job onwards, and even if that is only 25 or 50 quid a month, do it and save the 50 quid a month. And then the next question is, okay, so you've opened an ISA account, you've set up a direct debit of 50 quid a month or 100 quid a month, or if you're 45 and you're earning 200 grand a year, then 1500 quid a month. You can actually save 1665 quid a month in an ISA. So an ISA, and if you're a couple, you can save twice that, right? So for most people, you can save more than most people are able to save, and all of it can go into an ISA account. And just to be clear, what's good about an ISA account is you pay no tax. So all the returns you make in an ISA account are yours, and you don't end up paying the government capital gains tax. Hence why it's the sort of number one vehicle I think people should use for savings. And then the next question is, so what do I then put the money into? And here's where I've got to be a bit careful, because we have an investment fund. That's all I'm going to say, because I don't want this to turn into this isn't I don't want to end up being really salesy. If people want to learn about our investment fund, it's all there online. There's a document that explains what we do. Our fund basically owns 24 assets. So our fund owns all major asset classes in all major geographies, and it's available in to buy in these sorts of places. But frankly, you could buy any one of dozens of different funds, and still get the result. And particularly if you're starting really young, and this is here's what sounds like a sort of crazy statement. I quite often am on record as saying that successful investing is actually 90% admin and 10% asset selection. So just to sort of that, which sounds mad, like what are you talking about? And my point there is that the admin bit is finding the 10% of your salary each month, getting into a savings habit and having that paid out of your bank every month. I mean, you've heard of a book called Rich Dad Poor Dad, right?
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So I imagine a lot of your listeners will too. I mean, so that's exactly what Robert Kiyosaki talks about. Pay yourself first. As soon as you get paid, at least 10% of that needs to go straight across into some sort of investments. So once you've done that, that really is a huge amount of the battle won. And then the reason I say, kind of what you then invest in doesn't matter, is particularly if you're young, is for the following reason. So there are two professors at the London Business School called Elroy Dimpson and Paul Marsh, and they've consistently put a research piece out about, I mean, they write an awful lot of research on kind of financial market investment, but one of their really famous pieces is about investing in what are called small caps or smaller companies. And what they said is that they published a piece in 2015 that calculated that going back as far as 1955, if you'd invested, and you can do this, by the way, in an ISA account, you can invest in smaller companies. There are smaller company funds, lots of them. If anybody who'd invested in the bottom 2% of the London stock market by size, so the smallest two companies in the bottom 2% of the stock market, the annualized returns going back as far as 1955 are nearly 16%, depending on where you cut it. So over, by the way, for anybody who does understand compound interest we were talking about earlier, if you're making 15 or 60% 16% a year in your investments, and you're putting even a few hundred quid in, a couple of thousand quid a year or whatever the sort of numbers we've been talking about, you will become very wealthy in over a period of sort of 10, 15, 20 years, because of the power of compounding. Now, the point I'm trying to make is, so shouldn't that mean that, stop? And the point here is that small caps are very, in inverted commas, risky, right? So here I am saying from 1955 to the present day, you'd be returning 15+% per annum, and that means you become a millionaire, and even with pretty small numbers. The same actually can be said of biotechnology shares. So anybody who's been buying biotech's basically done about 14% a year for 20 years if you buy a fund of biotech shares. So then the answer is, well, that's really easy, right? Why wouldn't you just so what, people can close their browser, stop listening to this interview, and go off and just put their ISA money into either a biotech fund or a small cap fund, and sit back and make 15% a year and become a millionaire. Easy, job done. The only problem is, and this again is a really key sort of focus of my book, is that since 1955, there have been 4 or 5 times where UK small caps will have fallen by 50, 60, or even 70%. So, the crash of 1987, the crash of the dot-com crash of 2000, 2001, the same in 07, 08, 09. Now, this is where psychology comes in. Most people cannot handle that level of loss, right? So, am I making sense?
You're making sense. You're making
um,
sense. Yeah.
yeah. So psychologically, even if you say, well, I've read this research piece from these 2 really smart professors at the London Business School that says, in the long run, this is all going to be fine, and I'll make 15% a year. When you're actually looking at your account, that thus far you've put, let's say, you're in your late 30s and you've managed to get to, I don't know, 30 grand in the account, and then at the end of the following year you're back down at 15 grand or 14 grand or something. It takes an extremely strong-willed person and psychologically strong person not to go, oh, the world's ending. And at the moment, this is exactly the sort of stuff. Look at anybody who's invested in crypto, as you know, right? That's how they're feeling right now, or that's how a lot of those people are feeling right now, or people who are obsessed with what's going on with Brexit. Oh, I shouldn't invest in the stock market because of Brexit, or because of Trump, or because of whatever else. The problem is, most people therefore are at risk of selling out and crystallizing that loss and then never investing again. And to go back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, putting their money under a mattress or in a cash account, or just in cash, which is a disaster for your long-term ability to get rich, right? And that is actually the experience of an awful lot of people who never really learn much about finance. That is, a lot of people do it. A lot of people get to a certain point in their life where they go, oh, I'm going to try this stock market investment thing, and they don't learn enough about it. Everything goes really well for a few years, and then a massive crash comes, and because they haven't learned enough about it, they panic, sell out, and never invest in shares again. Which is why average stock market returns of small caps, as I just said, is like 15%. But most people investing in small caps will probably end up losing money. Does that make
That makes
sense?
sense. Yeah. That
Um,
makes sense.
but then you basically got 2 choices, and this is why I said that asset selection doesn't matter, because if you know what I've just said, and you know it deep in your bones, and you've learned enough about it, then the first choice is and I'm talking about people in their late 20s or their early 30s. They're just starting off on their investment journey for the next 20 years. And if you say to yourself, you look yourself in the mirror and say, I'm psychologically strong enough, I know this information, I'm going to invest in crypto, I'm going to invest in biotech, I'm going to invest in inverted commas risky stuff, volatile risky stuff, but I'm going to do it every month without fail for the rest of my life until I'm 55 or 60 or whatever. There is a very, very, very high chance that that individual, if they do manage to tough it out over that lifetime, will become very wealthy. Now, so that's the first choice. Just be really psychologically strong and brave, and whenever you doubt yourself, read my book again or somebody else's book, and look at that sort of research and remind yourself that it will all be all right in the end. The other way of doing it is to do what I advocate, which is to own the world. Because as we said, half an hour ago, or whenever earlier in this conversation, if you own all asset classes and all geographies, you will not get those 50 or 60% down years. because as we said, in when the stock market is down 50% like it was in '07, '08, '09, gold will go up 20%, oil will go up 50%. When the American stock market has a complete disaster, the Japanese stock market might go up a lot, or the Brazilian stock market, or whatever. Now, that means that is the tortoise. The option one I just said of investing in crypto or biotech and just like being confident and riding it out is the hare. And as we all know from the Aesop's fable, right, the tortoise usually beats the hare. And the reason for that is just because most people are psychologically hardwired to cock it up when they get to a 40 or 50% down year. So yeah, that's another very long rambling answer, but hopefully it vaguely makes
No, that's
sense.
brilliant. I think that's really really useful advice. So okay, let's talk a little bit about so asset. You said asset selection is like more 10% and 90% is like the admin. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah,
And
well, yeah. I mean, those are pretty spurious numbers that I've just plucked out of
yeah,
thin air. But the broader point I'm trying to make is that a lot of people, and this again is the reframing point, right? Is a lot of people agonize about, well, I don't know anything about stock market investment. I don't understand financial markets. It's all very intimidating and complicated, and therefore they never save anything. And they hit their 30th and they wake up on with a hangover on the day after their 30th birthday, and they go, "Oh, I'm 30. I've got I've never sorted out this." And then another 10 years go by, and it's their 40th. People do this, and all I'm saying is, step one, pay 50 or 100 or 150 or whatever quid a month or whatever you can afford into an ISA account every month without fail by direct debit, right? And so that's my, if you like, my 90% of investing successes habit and admin. Because if you do that, you will get quite a crap result if it stays in cash. But if you find yourself, if you do that and you sort out that admin and you wake up one day with like 11 grand in your late 20s or whatever, it will just give you so much more of an incentive to start thinking, that will drive you naturally to think, what shall I do with this 11 grand? You will read books on investment. You will look at articles. You might read something like MoneyWeek magazine. You might finally get interested. And then you're just in a different place completely psychologically from somebody who just never starts that saving habit, right? So that's all I mean by it's kind of 90% admin, 10% fund selection. And that is particularly true for young people because of what I just said. Because basically, if you are young and you're doing this every month for the rest of your life until you hit an age where you want to use that money. Now if you're lucky, that could be 50 or 47, or even younger if you're able to pay. If you're lucky enough to get to a point where you make quite a lot of money and you're saving 10%, you can get to quite big numbers when you're quite young. But a lot of the thing, a lot of the thrust of what I do is kind of calibrated for people who are making kind of normal money, and the whole point is that even on normal money, if you learn this stuff, you can have a really really good result. But if you start young and you just pay into anything, even just an S&P 500 tracker fund, which is very easy to get in your ISA account, and just keep plugging away. And the other thing, just to sidetrack a little bit, a lot of people understand this intuitively, but paying every month is little and often is really key. It's like going to the gym, rather than saying, "Oh, I'm going to go." If you say, "Oh, 5 years from now, I'm gonna get really fit and start running every day," you never will, and don't do anything now, right? But if you just do one gym session a week and then two gym sessions a week, and get into the habit. And it's the same with money, and specifically saving a little bit now is far more likely to mean that you end up with a load of money in the future than saying, "Oh, when I turn 40, I'll start saving loads of money," right? And the other point about that is investing monthly by direct debit averages out your investments in financial markets. So if your first direct debit investment was in March 2007, and then the stock market plummeted not long afterwards, you're then still buying in every month at lower levels. A lot of people know that it's called pound cost averaging or averaging in, and that's a very important way to invest. And the other thing that goes back to my psychology point earlier about that is um, automating stuff and just automatically investing whatever you can afford every month for like your whole life removes you from the equation. Like, it removes you psychologically, and it means that because the other thing that's really important is to ignore the news. There is always a reason not to invest. Like, time after time after time, somebody says to me, well, I shouldn't be investing because of Brexit, or I shouldn't be investing because of Trump, or I shouldn't, and by the way, you could go back every year. You could go back to 1973 and say, I shouldn't be investing because of the OPEC oil crisis, or you could go to, that every people always think that they're living in much more dangerous and scary and worrying times than they actually are. And the lesson of history is you just need to put your fingers in your ears and close your eyes and just carry on investing in something sensible every month and ignore the news. And if you set stuff up and automate stuff by direct debit, you have a much higher chance of actually that being the action you take than if you try and time things.
Perfect.
And another really long rambly
No,
answer.
just brilliant, like jam packed with like really useful advice. I really like the idea of averaging in, right, so that you invest over time instead of just dumping it all in at once. I think that's smart and sensible, and particularly if you're new, it can be quite scary too.
That's right. And sometimes somebody who's lucky enough to have just inherited a fairly big chunk of money, for example, I always say, look, divide it by 10 and pay it into whatever you're going to invest over the next 10 months. If you inherit 100 grand or 20 grand or whatever, or you win, an article I've written quite a few times is aimed at lottery winners. 70% of people who win the lottery are bankrupt within 5 years,
It's crazy.
right? And
Crazy.
so it is, and that's because it's this, and this goes back to a point I made earlier. Being wealthy is not about having tons of money, as ridiculous as that sounds. It's about knowledge, and actually, so 70% of lottery winners who win millions and millions of pounds are bankrupt within 5 years because they never acquired that knowledge. And actually, another similar argument is estimates are that more than 150 ex-Premiership footballers are in prison. And there are similar stats on the other side of the Atlantic in America about ex-NBA and NFL stars who all end up, or many of whom end up in prison. And the reason is because even though they made 30 grand a week or 50 grand a week or 200 grand a week for, although those guys are they're usually okay. But, people who make these huge salaries and huge incomes, but never learn the sort of stuff that is, dare I be as self-promoting to say in my book, they blow through it all and they make stupid investments and they never learn any of this stuff. They get into gambling, whatever, and then in a bid to try and carry on funding that kind of lifestyle that they enjoyed when they were a Premiership footballer, they turn to things that are illegal, and that's why they end up in prison. So, and that's just another example of how this is not so much about income or whatever else; it's about knowledge. And yeah, I think it's really
Very,
important.
very powerful. So, and I think you've given some tremendous advice there. If we're looking at just like kind of a portfolio then of someone, and they're like, you know what, I want to own the world. I want to have this diverse. I want to diversify my portfolio, and I just want to do it in a safe way. Not investing all in biotech or something crazy like crypto, which I wouldn't recommend people do. Don't just throw your life savings into crypto. Well, like what does that look like percentage wise? Like, would you say, okay, 20% in
Well,
commodities, or what's your kind of
so
advice
there's so
there?
there's so there's a really that is actually, if you're going to really finesse this and really, and again, I don't want to bang on about my book too much and be too self-promotional, but I cover all this stuff in the book. And if you really want to go down the rabbit hole and really learn about this stuff and do the best possible job, the simple message is that actually asset allocation changes with age, and at the very so basically there's a sort of rule of thumb that says that you subtract your age from 100, and that tells you what percentage of your money should be in riskier assets. So, and though that would be stock market investments, or for example Bitcoin or biotech or whatever else. And just to sort of run that through, so that is actually quite logical. So if you're 30, you might invest 70% of your money that you're saving every month in something that is in inverted commas risky, because you've got like 30 or 40 years. If it falls, to go back to what I was saying earlier, if it falls 50% one year and you're 32, firstly, the pot of money, if you've only got 10 grand and you lose 40%, now you're down to 6 grand, right? if you've got £1 million because you're 60 and you've been investing for a lifetime and you use 40%, you've just lost 400 grand and you're now at 600 grand just at the point that you want to be using that money to live on, right? So that goes to my point. So then 100 minus, let's say you're 70 years old, 100 minus 70 is 30. You should have 70% of your money in really conservative stuff like bonds and cash, and only 30% of your money in riskier stuff. But the the sort of, again, I suppose there are two options here for people who are listening who maybe don't know anything about this stuff. One is to start a journey where you learn about what is a bond, what is a share, what is crypto and what is Bitcoin, what is gold, and you learn, and property. So you learn about the sort of 7 or 8 main investment classes, and then you learn about how you sort of mix those up as you get older, right? And the other alternative, again, without wanting to be excessively salesy, which is why we invented our investment fund as a response to people asking for it, because they said, Andy, because they got to the end of it and said, I really buy into this. I want to invest like this. How do I do it? And actually, our fund is a fund of 24 funds. And those are, American shares, British shares, Japanese shares, gold, energy commodities, agricultural commodities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Our fund is, is a global multi-asset fund, which enables you to own the world in one place. So, genuinely hand on heart, for somebody who thinks, oh, I really can't be bothered to learn about this stuff, that you might consider our fund, or indeed there are other companies that do funds that are similar to ours. And actually, I do cover a fair bit of that on my website and in past blog articles that you can find in our email archive and the opinion section of our website. So for I know, because my dad is like this. Us Brits are hugely cynical about being sold to, right? So for anyone who's listening to this and go, oh, this is, I've just listened to an hour of this nonsense just so this guy to like promote his fund at me, and I get that, and that's certainly how I can be like that myself. But we have a fund, but there are lots of other ways that you can do the same thing using somebody else's, right? Genuinely, but equally, as personally, because you've been part of our clutch of souls for however long you have, there's an awful lot that people can get from us and from what we do and what I do for free. So I send emails every 2, 3, 4 weeks, and crucially not every day, because I know how annoying daily bombarding emails are. But people who sign up to our email service, it is free. It genuinely is a free lunch, and all I do every 3 or 4 weeks is talk about this sort of stuff. And you like to think that what that means is that people who are on our email list, they might not sort it out in the first week or the first month or even the first year. But I've found over the years that people who followed me for 3 or 4 or 5 years, eventually they sort their finances out, and then they send me really nice emails saying, thank you, I really enjoyed your book, and now I've sorted my finances out. And that's just human nature. Sometimes it takes a while.
Absolutely, and I highly recommend reading How to Own the World and getting it on Amazon or from your website, and just because you do cover all the different asset classes in detail. You do cover the different kind of mindsets you need to have. You do break everything down. And I've been following you actually years before you created your fund. So I can speak from personal experience and say that the advice that you've given out is worth its weight in gold. And that is definitely, if you're interested in this idea of like how to own the world, your fund is, I'm not a financial advisor, so, I can't really give out that advice, is definitely something that I would look at, like, sincerely, because I've learned so much from you.
Well, my hope on that is, and to be clear, our fund really is a tortoise. Like, it's really boring. It's a proper sleep at night. It's not. And I think I might have said this actually to you, or you will have seen me post this. One of our biggest strategic challenges as a small business when we launched the fund in September 2017 was our fund bangs out, based on back testing, 20 years. We back test it to January 2001, and we bang out 7.5% returns, with really good downside protection. So and when we launched it, I had people saying, "Oh, Andy, I loved your book, and I've been so excited that you're going to launch fund, but I'm so disappointed because I make 7.5% a week in my crypto investments." And it's like, yeah. And since then, Bitcoin has fallen, 70 plus percent. When 2018, from the 1st of Jan to the 31st of December, it fell 72.5%. And so but it was, it was a real challenge, that people, to go to our earlier conversation about the kind of whole get rich quick thing. But I think what I hope is that after people have read my book and then read the document that explains what our fund does, they should be in a position to feel that they can make their own decision with real confidence about whether or not they want to invest in that tortoise. Or, if they're young and make a few quid, to invest in much more exciting things that might make, higher returns over a lifetime of investment. And it was really kind of you to say you've been following me years and long before so we've been going since 2011. I've been writing stuff, for since almost all the way back to then, and the fund's only existed since the end of 2017. And I've always been about our number, as I said earlier, financial literacy, and I've always been about. I think I say in the forward to the book, the difference between me and a lot of other people in the financial and services industry is I want you to learn how to look after your money rather than trust me to look after your money for you. And that's the whole thrust of what we do. Everything we do is geared to teaching people to understand finances themselves in a way that brass tacks actually works and makes a real difference in their lives. And just for what it's worth, the current version of the book only came out on March the 7th. So I had a pretty hideous year last year. I think I did about 30 weekends where I was working on the third edition of the book, which is the new edition that just came out last month.
Great
So
stuff.
so hopefully some people will buy it.
Great stuff. Great stuff. Just a couple more kind of questions and ideas, because on this podcast, the Who's Going to Stop Me podcast, we bring on people who are kind of unstoppable or that are doing new exciting things in their field. And so it would be a shame if we didn't get to know the person behind all these great ideas and the your book and your philosophy and kind of all this information that you're putting out there. So I guess a couple questions for you is, one, why do you care so much on a personal level about creating this financial literacy? Where does that interest come from? And you've done so many things. Like you mentioned there, updating the book, and it was 30 weekends. It took you 30 weekends of lots of writing, and you launched this fund, and you also got a full-time job, and you managed a website, and you wrote. What was that struggle like for you, going from say working to being an entrepreneur? Or give us a little context on who you are. That's what I'm really asking.
The classic question that us Brits hate is like, tell me about yourself. I don't know. Well, I mean, like all journeys like this, I think it's just step by step by step by step, right? And each little small step moves you to the next place. And I mean, so I left. I studied economics at university. I got a job in the city as a sort of scaly-skinned, evil stockbroker banker. But I was really, really lucky because I just by luck again, and there's a lot of luck in this sort of stuff, but by luck rather than judgment, I ended up doing smaller companies. Hence why I was talking about smaller company investment earlier, because it's an area of interest of mine. Although smaller companies, so I was a Swiss bank in the late 90s, and smaller companies meant, for example, EasyJet or HMV or Burberry or lastminute.com, or these are all businesses that, or Campari, the Italian drink brand. These are all companies that I was involved in raising money for them on the stock market. So in my sort of mid-20s, I was in this amazing position where I got to meet chief executives, the senior management of companies like EasyJet, a lot of quite household name companies, and travel around Europe with them and basically pitch those companies to investors and participate in investor meetings. And that just meant I became very, very, as I sort of say in my bio here and there, I have, as a statement of fact, I've met more than 1,000 chief executives in my life, in my adult life. And you can't fail to get really fired up about investment if that's your experience, because, one week you meet a fashion company, the next week you meet a software company, the next week you meet an airline, the next week you just get to see, you get to be at the coal face of so much that is exciting that's happening out there. And I suppose at the same time that I was lucky enough to be, enjoying that, I it became very clear to me that just how few people are ever taught anything about this stuff. Financial literacy is just such a huge sort of epic fail miss in societies, and not, not just in Britain, but all over the world. And sort of my understanding of, well, I mean, so we live in a capitalist society as a statement of fact, right? Definitionally, but 90% plus the population doesn't understand capitalism. They don't know how shares are valued. They don't know what the stock market is. And even just things like political. I mean, I am not particularly political. I actually think political parties and party politics is almost irrelevant. That's a slightly big statement, but not, you basically never more in history have you been able to get on with your life and focus on your economy, not the economy, than you can today, right? And that's kind of how I like to conduct myself. Um, but if you are talking about party political stuff, an awful lot of the discourse that happens and arguments about how, how should we fund the NHS, or all these sorts of things that are political hot potatoes, are discussions that happen between a lot of people who've never ever really understood how capitalism works, and how the stock market works, and how, without wanting to give a too ridiculous an example, nobody ever stops and thinks about how miraculous it is that you walk into Boots and, there's toilet paper from the forests of Scandinavia, and there's a thing called toothpaste that some bloke invented in 1890. Or, we live in this absolute paradise compared to people of 100 or 200 or 300 years ago, and the world keeps getting better. But there's I read a survey recently saying that only about 10% of people in the developed world think the world is getting better, but on every metric it is getting better in terms of health, leisure time, longevity, wealth. And so I suppose I'm really passionate about communicating that message, and a big part of that message is, you know if when people learn about this stuff, it makes their life easier, and it makes society better. And so I guess, I know you said how I got a full-time job. I do have a full-time job, and my full-time job is raising money for biotech companies. And that is incredibly exciting, and I'm very, very passionate about. I think we will have not. I mean, a cure is a big word, but treatments for really nasty things like cancer and dementia and Parkinson's and horrible rare diseases that mean that kids have bruise really easily, or their skin falls off, or all I've been lucky enough to be at the coalface of an awful lot of amazing things that are happening, and I just I want more people to come along and learn about that sort of stuff too. It's another very rambling, overly enthusiastic answer, but that is genuinely why. I think this subject matter, I think basic financial literacy is one of the key ways that society improves, and people have better lives, and I really believe that.
I think you're doing your own part, and really pushing this kind of information. You're doing something special. And to be honest, I haven't really seen anyone, at least in the UK. It might be different in America, but in the UK, that's doing it as well as you in such an accessible way. So
I'm very touched, mate. That's very,
yeah,
very kind of you.
so I'm excited to see what the future holds for you. And just to say, like, your passion on this call has been very clear. Your sincerity and your passion, and clearly we're trying to jam in, like, decades of financial information into 1 hour. So I know it's not easy for you, but I think you've done a tremendous job. One last question for you.
Thank you. Well,
sorry, go on.
Go on, yes. No, I was just going to say, plus it's a Saturday morning, which 9 times out of 10 means I'm slightly slow and hungover.
What does the future hold for you? One last question. I'd like to ask everyone this. What does the future hold? Like, is there anything special you're working on? Is it just a matter of...
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things. I mean, firstly, our fund is very young and new and small, and so I would really like the fund to be a big success. I want I want this new third edition of the book to be an even bigger success than we were lucky enough that the last one was, and just to sort of, I don't know, become a really well known commentator. I want this message to spread far and wide, and to if 100,000 people sorted out their finances because of me, that would be a massive result. And obviously, if 1 million people did, that would be even more of a result. And that would, look, brass tacks, or cards on the table, that would imply that I had quite a valuable business on my hands. And the great thing about having a valuable business is that you then have the freedom to pursue kind of a whole load of other passion projects that you might want to pursue. And this is hopefully this is several years in the future, but in that perfect scenario, yeah, there are an awful lot of things I'd like to do. There's another book I want to write, and actually my literary agent who kindly did the book deal on this current version of the book is chasing me for a summary proposal of that book, which is basically all about choice, and it's the sort of where financial literacy meets life habits and all this explosion in technology, where wearable fitness stuff. And obviously I'm not going to do a very good job writing this proposal if I can't even articulate it verbally, but there's another. Anyway, suffice to say, watch this space. I reckon within a year or two I'll certainly be working on that new book. I need a bit of a break, having done the third edition of the current book last year. But I would love to be in a position to do something about conservation. I'm yeah, I think anyone there's that old expression, to do good you must first do well. Well, if I do sufficiently well, I actually, the only direct debit that goes out of my account every month to a charity is to the World Wildlife Fund. And I think these issues are very, very important. Although people have accused me of being a climate change denier, I'm not a climate change denier. I just think that amazing technologies and amazing companies that we haven't even heard of or thought of will solve the problem a lot more quickly than getting rid of plastic bags. Or I don't what I'm not making my point very well, but I think that technology is the vector that's going to sort these problems out, like plastic in the sea, a lot more than consumer behavior, actually. And again, that goes back to my point of the more people are investors in shares and technologies and research and development, then the faster we can solve these sorts of problems, which is all part of my message. So yeah, I'd like to think that I get to, I don't know, 10 years from now, whatever, I get to pursue some of these passion projects. And record a really bad album of sort of crap house music for everyone to laugh at as well at some point.
Well, I think that's very noble, the conservation, and I'd be excited to read the book when it comes out and when you get around to writing that. So yeah, best of luck with those. And again, thank you so much for coming on. I've learned a lot, even though I've read your book and I've read a lot of your articles. I've learned a lot in this conversation.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity. It's really kind of you. As I say, it's funny, you and I, in finding a diary slot to do this, ended up being Saturday evening your time and Saturday morning my time, which you'll forgive me for being pretty slow to begin with, and probably a bit less concise than I might have been at I don't know, 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. But hopefully we got there in the end.
No, I think it's brilliant, and I think everyone who's listening, if you took something away from this, leave a comment, leave a rating. Write about your key takeaway from this podcast, and I'm sure Andrew would love to hear that, and I definitely would. So where can
and definitely and do join our free email list, because it's only every 3 or 4 weeks, and dare I say, suggest buy the book, or borrow the book from someone else.
So where should people find out about your book? What are your main websites? Where can they sign up to these email lists if they're listening?
Yeah, so the website is www.plainenglishfinance.com. It's .com and .co.uk. We have both, so it doesn't matter. But so Plain English Finance, Plain PLAIN rather than PLANE, which some people have made that mistake in the past. So yeah, just plainenglishfinance.com. And the book, I mean, dare I say that probably the easiest place to find the book is on Amazon. If you go to amazon.co.uk or amazon.com and type in "How to Own the World" or Andrew Craig, you should find it reasonably quickly. And it's the first edition was a lurid light blue color. The second edition was black, and the new edition, which has 10,000 words of new content on things like crypto, for example. So crypto wasn't in the last edition. But this time, I couldn't really leave it out, given it's a book about all the various financial assets in the world. It is in this edition, so make sure you get the dark blue third edition, which is the latest edition, and yeah, you can find it on Amazon pretty easily.
Perfect. And as I've said, if I haven't said it enough, I highly recommend you check out Andrew's website and the book, and I learnt a lot. So thank you very much, and yeah, have a great Saturday, I guess.
You too. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please go over to iTunes, Google Play, or Spotify, subscribe to us. If you think we deserve a 5-star rating, then please leave us a rating. We also have exclusive show notes and bonus content over at whosgoingtostopme.com, so I highly recommend you check that out. For daily lessons and nuggets of advice, please head over to our Instagram @StopMePodcast. Until next time.